at the boundary of what had once been my backyard, observing Karen from a HOA scream at a city inspector while her 800 pre-zero McMansion gradually sank another inch into the mud. Flash flood warnings issued from idled squad cars. Frogs croaked off front lawns. And somewhere out there, across the swampy hellscape, a rusted mailbox drifted by like a funeral float. Yep, that's me. You're likely thinking, how in the world did we get to this point? I never thought a bony little creek running across my backyard would become a call to arms. But that's just what occurred. For years, that water trickle was my sanctuary, my reward. After days at the welding bench and belly crawling under houses for a living, I would sit in an old folding chair beside the creek, beer in one hand and fishing rod in the other, although I never managed to catch anything larger than an intrigued bluegill. Dragonflies darted past the high reeds. The wind smelled like damp grass, and all that could be heard at night was the soft burble of water filtering through the rocks. It was the type of peace you did not tamper with. Then the HOA moved in. Technically, the HOA had been present on the opposite side of the development for years, all snug in their similar beige houses with their identical mailboxes and suspiciously synchronized porch pumpkins. Every year in October, we creek ciders were the old times, the remnants of when around here there was nothing but fields and dirt roads. But boundaries were redrawn, there were annexations, and next thing we knew, the HOA had crept into our lives like a slick of oil. I first sampled their hogwash when a woman named Karen Mitchell appeared on my porch on a humid Saturday morning, clipboard clutched to her chest like some kind of medieval shield. She was wearing pastel-colored workout attire, even though she obviously wasn't working out, and her smile was as warm as a tax audit. She told me she was the HOA Community Standards Chair, and I told her I was busy, but this did not deter her. She had issues with my property. More to the point, she had issues with my creek. It was an unauthorized water feature that was a bigger safety hazard to neighborhood kids and animals. I gazed at her as if she had just accused my cat of operating a Ponzi scheme. The creek was natural, had existed long before any of us arrived with our mortgages and zero-turn lawn mowers. It was as much a part of the landscape as the trees and the boulders. Karen did not care. Karen had rules, hazardous open water, and inviting non-native species, because apparently frogs now totaled as foreign invaders. I disregarded it. A week later, I received a second notice, this one with threat of fines of $100 per day if I did not provide a plan for putting my property into compliance. I replied to it with a plain letter referencing county codes and including a copy of the survey of the land indicating $100 per day, unless I might Tom the Creek's status. They followed up by ordering a mandatory inspection. That inspection resulted to be 3 individuals I had never laid eyes on before roaming my backyard with tape measures and cell phones, taking pictures as if constructing a case against me for crimes against war. Karen directing from the perimeter of my lawn, tapping her toes impatiently as I stood there, arms folded, challenging them to venture 1 inch onto the creek itself. They did not, but took enough notes. 1 week later, at the required HOA meeting that I had not remotely intended to attend until then, she invoked insurance risks, wildlife appeal, mosquito breeding, and potential future erosion threatening a nearby property. The hypocrisy of declaring a natural creek hazardous while residing alongside a marshy swamp did not seem to be on her radar. When I rose to contest, she smiled smugly and gave me a packet of forms, insisting I fence the whole creek, fill it in, or agree to weekly HOA inspections for a year on my own dime. I informed her and the whole room where she could stuff her paperwork, nicely, naturally. After that, they got uglier. I began receiving anonymous complaints of my unshorn landscaping and lack of property maintenance standards on my door every other day. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked off its post. One morning, somebody spilled a load of landscaping rocks onto the shallow end of the creek, causing it to back up somewhat and a strain against the banks. I caught Karen herself one afternoon photographing my yard from behind her SUV parked across the street with the engine idling like some kind of suburban private eye. I would not budge. I left the creek in its natural state, left the reeds cropped, left the flow unobstructed. It was my land, my water, and my damnable right to sit next to it in peace. I should have known they would not stop there. It happened early on a Wednesday morning. I was having coffee on the back porch when I heard the low rumble of heavy machinery. At first, I thought it was city workers repairing the pothole up on Maple Drive, but the sound got closer, much closer. I stood up just in time to watch a little cement truck slowly back down the side alley between my house and the one after it. A guy in a neon vest and hard hat was maneuvering it like he was parking a Ferrari, yelling to the driver over the roar of the engine. I ran down the steps and across the yard just as they set up the chute directly over the top of my creek. "Hey!" I yelled, waving my arms. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" The vest guy barely gazed at me. "Just carrying out work, doing orders, sir. Drainage avoidance project approved by the HOA." I hadn't got another word out before the chute came swinging down and a thick gray deluge of wet concrete started gushing down into the creek. I lost it. I charged but got my feet on the muddy grass and fell hard on my side, scabbing my arm. By the time I scrambled back to my feet, the cement was already spreading like a toxic ooze, coating pebbles, drowning reeds, suffocating water itself. Frogs jumped desperately away from the flow, but some were too slow, stuck in the sticky goo as it hardened. The driver continued to spin drums, casually filling the whole upper bend with thick gray sludge, while the vest guy consulted the clipboard and nodded in approval. I yelled at them to stop, to show me paperwork, to get off my land, but they just ignored me. By the time they finished and pulled away, my beautiful creek had been reduced to a grotesque concrete scar, a silent, lifeless ditch that stretched from one end of the yard to the other. A slow rage settled into my bones as I stood there, dripping mud and blood, staring at the smoking ruins of what had once been the heart of my house. Karen stood on the sidewalk, arms folded, grinning, as if she had just won a game of chess. She thought I did not even realize we were playing. I brushed mud from my eyes, stood up straight, and grinned right back. Let her win this round. She did not know what kind of tempest she had just released. The first rain was nearly a relief after the summer. We had a heavy sheet of gray rolling in from the west and soaking the baked streets of our neighborhood in a welcome flood of cool water. I sat on my porch and watched it come, arms crossed, coffee growing cold in my hands as thick drops hammered the roof and turned the lawn into a muddy sponge. Usually, the creek would have handled it without complaint, its little gurgling mouth swallowing the runoff and carrying it downstream like it had done for more than any of us had lived here. But this time, there was no creek to catch it, only a long concrete scar hard and slick and useless. I watched the water hit the concrete channel, swirl uncertainly, and then begin to back up, pulling across the lawn and into the low spots like an old man trying to remember his way home. Within an hour, puddles stretched across my backyard like ugly gray bruises. By noon, the sidewalk in front was ankle-deep with dirty runoff, tiny bits of mulch and garbage whirling in slow circles where storm drains clogged. On the other side of the street, Karen Mitchell stood on her porch beneath an umbrella the size of a beach tent, thin-lipped, grinning as water lapped against the curbs and flower beds. 2 storms and the first real issues were starting to show. Mrs. Jensen at the corner house woke up to discover her carpeting in the basement squirting around under her feet. Mr. Bisa's recliner and a swore at 8@4.org. Alvarez had to sandbag his front door after a river of runoff came pouring down the slope of his front yard, straight into his porch. Maple Drive gutters ran so full they filled the entire cul-de-sac into a stagnant pond, holding a couple of unfortunate cars up to their wheel wells in filthy brown broth. And each and every time, the HOA issued a notice accusing the homeowners. Improper grading of lawns, plugged personal drains, not keeping property water runoff up to HOA standards. It was never their fault. Karen and her cronies never once brought up the fact that by filling in the natural drainage course with concrete, they had disabled the entire runoff system. It was like the creek had never existed, erased from their minds the way you might erase a guilty footprint of a crime scene. I said nothing publicly. I attended the meetings, nodded politely when they displayed satellite photos with red circles around the trouble spots, observed as they approved new emergency measures mandating mandatory property drainage inspections, which conveniently cost $250 per household. I played the fool. Inwardly, I logged everything, every storm. I strolled the neighborhood with my old Nikon camera hanging around my neck, playing the hobbyist photographer while quietly taking hundreds of photos, flooded yards, underwater mailboxes, water collecting along the newly landscaped common grounds. I kept a notebook, too, with times, dates, places, and notes on which houses were hit worst. I even began flying my old drone after the larger storms, taking aerial photos of the way the water moved, or rather, did not move. No one seemed to care. They were too busy arguing, because as the water issues increased, so did the arguing between neighbors. Mrs. Jensen complained that the Alvarez children clogged the storm drain with a soccer ball. The Hendersons complained about the Patels putting in a new flower bed that allegedly rerouted runoff onto their lawn. Former beer-busting barbecue recipe traders now filed formal complaints against one another for willful water mismanagement. The HOA, of course, went whole hog on it. They tasked Karen with leading a new flood mitigation task force, which largely appeared to entail her writing increasingly aggressive violation notices and rushing through emergency fines with no votes. And meanwhile, the actual drainage system just rotted under the strain. The handful of storm drains we had were never designed to deal with the complete runoff of our area without the natural creek helping out, and they suffocated under the loads of the storms like a guy trying to inhale through a straw. Streets cracked, lawns got swept away, mold crawled up the sides of garage doors, and somehow, despite it all, the blame always fell at the residents' feet. I overheard one neighbor grumbling sourly at the mailbox one morning that perhaps Karen should get herself together for failing to control the weather. The sarcasm was thickening faster than the floodwater. I held my tongue, merely nodded sympathetically, and stuck another set of printed photographs into my expanding evidence file. It wasn't just the water rising, it was resentment, thick and ugly, mounting pressure beneath the surface of our neat neighborhood, like steam beneath a cracked kettle lid. You could sense it in the way people avoided eye contact with one another at HOA meetings, the way hushed conversations were cut off short when certain board members passed by. And Karen, well, Karen seemed to feed on it. She strutted around wearing her HOA badge like a sheriff's star, savoring every new grievance, every new fine imposed upon houses she disliked. She even paid me a special visit to my door one afternoon, insincere smiling and telling me that because of continuing drainage problems, I had to submit a complete landscaping plan for approval by the end of the month. I inquired whether the plan had to take into consideration the literal wall of concrete they had poured onto my property without my authorization, but she merely blinked slowly and said that any changes to the existing drainage structures were subject to additional fines. I signed on the line with a grin, accepted her official-looking form, and added it to my ever-thickening binder of ammunition. Let them dig their own graves. I was calm, I had time, and I knew something they did not. Nature does not forget. Water does not forgive. And concrete, for all its smug permanence, cannot hold out forever against the simple, unstoppable persistence of rain and gravity. It would not be long now. The cracks were already showing if you knew where to look. I saw it in the slow but steady sink of Mr. Alvarez's retaining wall, in the widening puddle that never quite dried up at the base of the Hendersons' driveway, in the way Mrs. Jensen's front lawn looked suspiciously tilted toward the street after the last big storm. The earth was moving imperceptibly at first, like cat readjusting its weight prior to pouncing, but still moving nonetheless, all because they had attempted to asphalt over something that was never intended to be tamed. I kept my head lowered, kept my lips sealed, kept my camera batteries full, because it wasn't just me they had wronged any longer. It was all of us, and when the dam finally broke, I was going to have front row seats. The third week of rain began like a drum roll, soft at first, hardly a whisper against the window panes, and then it grew in strength, building into a full-throated roar that darkened the skies and filled the air with the scent of wet earth and ozone. The weathermen flashed warnings on every station, labeling it a 100-year storm, a freak coming together of cold fronts and soaked ground. But out here in the neighborhood, it simply felt like Judgment Day. The streets became rivers overnight, asphalt vanishing under swirling gray currents flecked with bits of sod and shattered mulch, manhole covers belching brown geysers into the air, gutters tearing loose from the sides of houses with sharp metallic groans. The water too much for the flimsy construction to bear, lawns vanishing beneath dirty lakes that shimmered under the streetlights like glass and oil. And the houses, God help them, the houses began to crack. It started small, hairline fractures webbing across driveways and walkways, easy enough to overlook if you blinked or attributed it to settling. But then the true damage emerged. Long, jagged fissures creeping up stucco walls like lightning scars. Door frames curving until front doors wouldn't close. Garage floors sagging as the ground beneath them moved inside. I sat watching it all from my porch, the same folding chair, the same dented thermos of coffee, a quiet sentinel watching as nature took back what it was owed. Standing ankle-deep on the other side of the street was Karen Mitchell, screaming into her cell phone, gesturing frantically at the lake that had engulfed her prize-winning rose bushes and was now slurping its way up onto the steps of her front porch. Her beautiful suburban heaven was dissolving into a swamp, and she could not do anything to stop it. She tried, of course. The HOA flailed around like ants from an upset-kicked nest, convening makeshift emergency meetings in the community center, giving away sandbags from the back of a rented U-Haul, sending frantic emails, blaming clogged city drains, or even freakishly high tides. They hired a landscaping firm that excels at quick water cleanup, which primarily involved pouring gravel into the worst puddles and crossing their fingers. Karen herself led the charge, charging the city with negligence, filing grievances, threatening lawsuits, complaining about how their tax money paid for them to deserve better drainage. But the reality hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, because anyone with eyes could see where the problem began. It began where the creek had once flowed. It began in my backyard, and so naturally the blame shifted once more. First, it was whispered among the HOA board members during emergency meetings. Then it showed up in passive-aggressive emails sent to all residents. Finally, Karen made it official, marching up to my porch one afternoon with a clipboard and a notice warning us of a violation that seemed thicker than a phone book: substandard property maintenance, lack of installments of adequate drainage infrastructure, contributing to neighborhood flooding. Her voice shook with barely suppressed anger as she read the charges out loud, water still dripping off the hem of her designer raincoat. I sat there calmly, sipping coffee, nodding at all the right places, allowing her to rant every last ounce of her anger and fear and rage. I signed nothing. I uttered hardly a word. I merely smiled that slow smile that narrowed her eyes with suspicion because I had something she did not. I had known it for weeks now, sitting quietly in the knowledge like a trapdoor spider, waiting for the right moment. They thought they had erased the creek with a few yards of concrete and some paperwork. But creeks, real creeks, are the stubborn things. They are written into the bones of the land, etched deeper than any human survey or HOA covenant. The water had not vanished. It had merely gone beneath the surface, seeping through the earth, along its accustomed paths, soaking the ground layer by layer until it could no longer be denied. The foundations were cracking, not due to clogged drains or rain alone. They were cracking because the ground itself was moving, swollen with contained water, straining against the unnatural constraints humans had foolishly placed. And I had evidence. Hidden in my files were the drone photos of the early minor pooling, the aerial maps indicating the slow, inevitable movement of the water towards the lower-lying houses, the city floodplain maps that had never been revised since the HOA's illegal creek alteration. Even some quiet conversations I had documented with contractors and surveyors who confirmed off the record that the alterations done by the HOA broke a number of county drainage codes. But I was not prepared to spring the trap just yet. No, this had to become worse. It had to hurt. It had to shatter them. And going by the increasing tension in the neighborhood, we were nearly there. You could sense it, like the heavy electric buzz before a storm. In the manner neighbors glared at one another across waterlogged sidewalks. In the manner one's voice grew sharp and indignant at HOA meetings. In the manner, the once neat lawns now bent under the burden of mud and bitterness. Karen picked up on it too. She doubled up on enforcement, enacting new rules, new penalties, new checks. She put together a neighborhood revitalization committee charged with finding homes that were adding to the visual degradation of the neighborhood. And guess whose name was at the top of the list? I grinned when the notification came in. 3 pages of general accusations and veiled threats. I added it to my mounting binder, making sure to insert a copy into the waterproof container I had planted at the bottom of the old oak tree in back, just in case. Because folks like Karen, once they felt the earth giving way beneath them, got desperate, and desperate people made errors, huge ones. All I had to do was sit tight, and the land itself would do the heavy work. It was already occurring. You could see it in the slumped frames of once proud entryways, the stooped fences, the broken retaining walls. You might hear it in the anxious small talk at the coffee shop, the whispers at the mailboxes, the not so subtle for sale signs springing up quicker than mushrooms after a hurricane. The neighborhood was decaying from the inside out, much like Karen's paper kingdom of rules and regulations. And yet, somehow she believed she could salvage it by tracking me into submission. She believed this was about me. That was her killing flaw. This was not about me. It was about the land, about the water, about forces older and stronger and infinitely more patient than she could ever comprehend. And very soon, she was going to learn that lesson the hard way. The heavy envelope had sat at the bottom of my filing cabinet for years, tucked between yellowed manuals and a cracked box of Christmas lights I never hung. I found it the night after Karen dropped latest violation notice on my doorstep. Her smug grin is still fresh in my memory. It had been pure stubbornness that drove me into the garage that night, flashlight clenched between my teeth, rifling through old boxes until I found the battered blue folder my grandfather had given me when he signed over the property. Might be useful someday, he had said, and then promptly refused to explain. I pried the envelope open with the tip of a screwdriver and discovered a treasure trove within. Ancient land surveys dating back to 1952. A stamped letter from the County Water Authority dated 1978, asserting a permanent natural drainage easement directly through what was now my yard. Copies of state environmental protection orders delineating the creek as part of a protected watershed. That is to say, difficult official evidence that my little creek was not only a pretty landmark, but a legally sanctioned drainage channel, one no homeowners association, however drunk on power, had the authority to fill, block, reroute, or otherwise fiddle with. And that was precisely what they had done when they filled it with concrete. I settled back on the icy concrete floor, the papers spread out like a hand of winning cards, and exhaled a long, slow breath. They had screwed up big time, but getting it proved would require more than just waving these documents around at the next HOA meeting. I needed the right people to see them. People with badges, people with clipboards, people who could shut Karen down the way a dam shuts down a river. So I made some calls, first to the County Water Authority requesting a property inspection due to suspected unauthorized modification of natural drainage systems. Then to the City Environmental Office presenting it as a concern for possible wetland violations. I used my real name, gave my real property information, but tactfully omitted any reference to the HOA at this time. Let them discover the smoking gun themselves. As the bureaucratic wheels turned, I turned my attention to the second phase of my plan, anonymous whistleblowing. It was easier than I expected. A burner email address, a gently worded message detailing the circumstances, complete with aerial drone photos, time-stamped images of the concrete pour, copies of the vintage easement documents, and references to county code infractions. I mailed it to all local newspapers, the city paper, a couple of well-known suburban Facebook groups, and just for kicks, the HOA gossip site that Karen had excluded me from last year. And then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days passed before a white county truck came down my street, followed by a second one with the city seal on it. 2 inspectors emerged, one with a clipboard, the other carrying what appeared to be a surveyor's tripod. They walked across the muddy sidewalk, dodging the flooded yards gingerly, and arrived directly at my front door. I invited them in, treated them to coffee, and set out the whole story in even, measured tones, supported by solid evidence. They listened, posed some sharp questions, and then spent the next 4 hours thoroughly examining the creek area, measuring the concrete fill, collecting soil samples, and snapping photographs from all sides. I observed from my porch as they took notes, consulted quietly, scowled a great deal, and eventually shook their heads gravely before climbing into their trucks. In the evening, the initial news report appeared. It was a brief report on the evening news, a grainy overhead photo of our subdivision bobbing on a sea of muddy water. As the reporter described how unauthorized changes to natural drainage systems had exacerbated flooding and potentially broken numerous environmental protections. They refused to mention the HOA, but only a matter of time. The following morning, I discovered a certified letter stuffed into my mailbox, official notice of investigation. It was written to the HOA, but naturally Karen was already aware. The manner in which she stormed into the emergency board meeting that afternoon told me all I needed to know. I remained long enough only to see her stalk up to the podium, cheeks flushed, hair frizzed by the rain, and bang down a thick pile of papers down in front of the shell-shock board members. She raged about slander, about false accusations, about renegade residents undermining the community. She accused the county of overreach, the city of corruption, the media of bias. She accused everyone but herself. Behind her, meanwhile, the projector screen came to life, displaying images that had obviously been drawn from the whistleblower packet. Photos of the concrete truck spilling into my creek. Maps of the natural easement running straight through my property. Shots of the county codes they had broken in bold red text. The room fell silent, save the soft hum of the air conditioner. Even the board members, usually swift to nod in agreement with Karen's every pronouncement, shifted uneasily in their seats, eyes flicking to one another, to the floor, anywhere but her. She was boxed in and she knew it. But Karen was nothing if not a stubborn. She doubled down, insisted the concrete was a temporary erosion control measure, demanded that the HOA was entitled to beautify common areas, even suggested that she had verbal approval from someone at the county to make improvements. But when one of the more reserved board members intimidatingly demanded written evidence, Karen's mouth clamped shut like a steel trap, because there was none, and she knew it. That evening, the second wave of news coverage hit, this time much more severe. Words like illegal, reckless, possible civil and criminal sanctions were tossed around with gusto. A few residents were interviewed, some on camera, complaining about their outrage, their fears regarding property values, their worries regarding mold and foundation damage. A local environmental advocacy group caught wind of the story and began circulating a petition calling for a full investigation and compensation for damaged homeowners. In a week, the county had official violation notices posted on the community center doors. City inspectors started knocking on doors not to issue HOA fines, but to perform property inspections related to flooding and foundation integrity. Lawsuits began simmering in the background, whispering rumors circulating like wildfire that several homeowners intended to sue both the HOA and individual board members for negligence and property damage. And at the eye of the storm was Karen, struggling to plug the leaks in a ship already half submerged. She attempted to rally her loyalists, the few die-hard rule followers who still believed in the righteousness of HOA governance, but their numbers dwindled with every soggy basement and cracked wall. She tried to spin the narrative, claiming victimhood, alleging conspiracies, but nobody was buying it anymore. The neighbors who once nodded along to her tirades now crossed the street to avoid her. The board meetings, once packed with sycophants, now barely scraped together a quorum. Her kingdom was crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. I watched it all unfold from my porch, sipping my coffee, flipping through the burgeoning pile of news stories and legal notices with quiet satisfaction. Because Karen may have had the HOA in her pocket once, but now the county, the city, the news and the law had her by the ankles, pulling her down inch by inch. She had constructed her kingdom on arrogance and asphalt, filled her delusional confidence with concrete, and in so doing, she had forgotten the simplest rule of all. Nature always prevails, and this time it was going to prevail in a spectacular style. The initial round of city citations came like a thunderclap, thick envelopes stuffed into every HOA board member's mailbox, each with the ominous weight of official government letterhead and lawyer speak sharp enough to slice steel. Karen's expression when she opened hers was something I would have paid good money to witness, but the real spectacle came later that afternoon when the city posted the first red stickers on the front doors of a dozen houses, including her own. Unsafe structure, unstable foundation, immediate occupancy prohibitions, pending remediation. In English, their dream homes had been deemed uninhabitable. I sat on my porch and watched as families stood dumbstruck in the rain, gaping at the bright orange warning placards as if they could not quite grasp what was occurring. Movers' vans lined the streets within days, engines grumbling as bewildered homeowners scrambled to save what they could from houses that had begun sinking into the earth like the slow-motion shipwrecks. Karen tried to fight it, of course. She hired a lawyer, threatened to sue the city, screamed at the inspectors in her driveway until her voice cracked, but it was no use. The damage was too obvious, the evidence too overwhelming, the paper trail of negligence too thick to ignore. The final nail came from the insurance companies when the initial claims came in for water damage, foundation collapse, and mold remediation. The adjusters descended like vultures and pecked the corpses bare. Act of negligence, they claimed. Policy violations, lack of proper drainage structures, denied. No payouts, no repairs, no hope. Without insurance cash, the homeowners were stuck. Their homes worthless, their mortgages draining them dry. Foreclosure notices began appearing in windows like paper ghosts. Karen's own house, once the pride of the neighborhood, with its trimmed hedges and artificial Greek columns, was the first to be officially condemned. By the final week of the month, she was sleeping in a borrowed motorhome, parked in the out-of-the-way end of the development, the wheels sinking slowly into the same mud she had awakened. The HOA failed soon after. At the special meeting convened in the burned-out shell of the community center, the remnants of remaining residents voted to disband the organization as a whole. No fanfare, no speeches, just a simple majority raised in bitter rain-soaked hands. Karen attempted to object, but no one even bothered to argue. She was done, and she knew it. The final accounting financial report was read in a voice so hollow it might as well have been a funeral dirge. More than $2.3 million in projected legal liabilities, 0 assets, bankruptcy imminent. A motion was made, seconded, and passed to dissolve the HOA immediately. Karen was seen pulling boxes of shredded documents out of the community center in the presence of a city marshal. But that was not the end, because even as the HOA met its well-deserved demise, the neighborhood had a decision to make. Attempt to mend the broken system the old way, or go back to the original wisdom of the land. The vote to bring back the natural drainage succeeded with hardly any objections. The County Environmental Office provided grants for watershed restoration. Volunteers stood in line to assist. Even some of the displaced homeowners who had previously snubbed me were willing to lend a hand. For weeks, we dug, shoveled, and planted, stripping away the concrete wounds to expose the soft, thirsty earth below. We redirected the water down its original course, not with pipes and pumps and asphalt, but with native grasses and willow trees and strategically placed stones. The first time the creek ran again, clear and laughing through my backyard, it was as though I had heard an old friend summon my name after a long time apart. I sat next to it, legs dangling in the cool stream of water, and smiled as the dragonflies came back. The frogs croaked in the reeds, and the earth itself breathed out in relief. But I was not yet done. One bright morning, while the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of rebuilding and rebirth, I planted a little wooden sign at the head of the creek, where it bent onto my property. I whittled the letters myself with the whittling knife, slow and deliberate, until the message stood out clean and bold for anyone passing by to see. Nature always wins. It was not spite. It was not gloating. It was truth, pure and simple. For all their rules and fines and concrete and arrogance, they had forgotten the oldest law of all, that no matter how high you build your walls, however many long papers you sign, however many stamps you press, you cannot own the land forever. It remembers long after you have forgotten. It waits, and when the time is right, it takes back what is its own. Karen took off long after that, towing her dented RV behind the rusty pickup truck with a cracked rear window. No parade, no party. Just a few curious looks and lots of relieved space. The house she once lorded over now sat abandoned, half swallowed by the very swamp she had helped create, a monument to hubris and stupidity. The new families who moved in never asked much about the past. They saw the restored creek, the lush wetlands, the healthy trees and thriving gardens, and they were content to let the land tell its own story, a better story, a lasting one. Every so often, I still find myself sitting by the creek, seeing the water dance across the stones, hearing the frogs sing at sunset, feeling the earth firm and sure beneath my boots. I run my fingers across the rough wood of the sign and smile to myself because I know what it costs to win this peace. And I know that whatever comes next, whoever tries to tame it, or own it, or remake it, the land will stand. It will remember. It will triumph as it always has. The air reeked of the swamp rot and concrete dust as I stood,